You don't give him a chance to shoot you, especially if he's an outlaw. But, you know, the opening sequence is really interesting because it shows Matt shooting down a guy in a gun battle in the streets of Dodge. And the other fellow is in the distance, and tiny. And so we see them both draw and hear the gunshots. And of course the other guy falls, although we see him only at the distance. But we pan up to Matt and Matt's face. And Matt's face is just this kind of unreadable quality. You know, there's a Pinter-esque element to Gunsmoke. Just like characters in the Birthday Stanley, you know, doesn't quite understand what's happening, why it's happening the way it's happening. Or characters like Kafka. I mean, that story about the hanging, the gallows, where Matt brings this guy to hang. I mean, that sounds like something pure Kafka, where this, you know, all-enveloping law determines everything. But we come again and again back to Matt. Matt's understanding of reality as reflected in his face. His saying neither yay nor nay at the end, but just enduring beyond any kind of dichotomy. You know, doesn't like, hey, I did a great job, I killed the bad guy, let's drink a beer. Instead, there's just kind of this pained expression in Matt. You know, I've lived to fight another day. And that endurance is what most characterizes him. And I guess that's part of the reasons of the popularity for the show. You know, yeah, you have action series and, you know, shootouts and that kind of thing. But again and again, it comes back to this single person. You know, this could be Beckett or Harold Pinter or any absurdist playwright, where the main character has to essentially face emptiness, nothingness, death, senselessness. And you see that register on Matt's face again and again, but in that opening sequence, the title sequence, you know, where he shoots that guy for 20 years in the opening sequence, although they did change it a little bit. You know, it shows him pulling the gun and shooting, but there's no real emotion on his face. It's almost like a mechanical action. And then on his face you get the reaction, like, you know, I've lived to fight another day. I'm an existential hero. Nothing is taken for granted. Unlike Joel McRae's character in Ride the High Country, Matt Dillon never talks about going into his house justified. He's just a more raw, pure element of kind of pure reaction. And I'm sure people living in the 50s, when the show started and was most popular through the early 60s, that you're living in the era of the Cold War, you know, missile crises. And as much as an escape as a Western might be from those contemporary fears of annihilation, not to mention just materialism, meaninglessness of mass media in the mass consumer culture age, you come back to just that awareness that there's something heroic in just surviving. There's something heroic, and it's not even heroic, there's just something about endurance as a quality that makes someone worth watching. It's interesting, and I'll end this segment with this. That opening sequence, I think, is drawn from a sequence where Matt has to fight a guy named Hack Prine, who's a former lawman who's now become a hired killer. And Hack Bryan's in town to kill somebody. And of course Matt has to stop him. And of course Hack Bryan was the fastest draw in Kansas, in the West, Nebraska, wherever, when Matt was just coming up. But Matt has to face him down. And it's almost like facing his father. You think of something like The Judgment by Kafka, you know. This is kind of this mythic confrontation. Matt is almost facing another version of himself. And that's one of the things that you get again and again in these Grateful Dead, Grateful Dying scenes, is Matt shooting and killing someone who's almost a different permutation of Matt. That Lobo character is the mountain man that Matt might have become if he had stayed with Lobo and become a trapper, a mountain man. Hack Bryan is essentially a future Matt, a Matt who can no longer serve as Marshal of Dodge, although he seems to be fated to do this eternally. Still, there's always the hint, the possibility that he can't do this forever. And there's no pension for Matt, you know. What happens when you become an old lawman and can't face down your opponents? You end up like Hack Bryan and becoming a killer. Now, that's not to say Matt's going to become a killer, but he shoots down Hack Bryan and essentially kills a permutation of himself, a potential version of himself. And of course, he has that ritualistic moment where he's kneeling down beside the dead and dying Hank Bryan, and Hack Bryan says, oh, you know, essentially thanks Matt for killing him so he can go out cleansed, redeemed. So I think that's another element for the popularity of the show. And I think it's a mistake to look at Gunsmoke simply as a, you know, like a right-wing reactionary, you know, death wish of the 1950s kind of television show. Good triumphing over evil, because a lot of times good doesn't necessarily triumph over evil in Gunsmoke. It kind of barely stays even with evil. And even when Matt has to do something like kill Hack Bryan, there's an awareness of the good and evil of the act. But Hack Bryan, you know, thanks Matt, you know, it's best to go out this way kind of comment. Which is really interesting, because I think that's what Ritual is about. Ritual is about redemption. Transcendence to the degree that kind of a materialistic, maybe even nihilistic, noirish philosophy allows you to attain. You know, this isn't a traditional religious kind of redemption. It's not communion, although in some respects it's kind of like a communion, as a dying person will get a sip of water or something like that, say his last words that impart, you know, some kind of message to Matt, and then you have Matt ruminating, you know, thinking. And we don't ever know completely what he thinks, but you just kind of read it on his face that he's had this experience, and that the experience was the experience, and at some level it's irreducible to words. So that's another element, I think, of kind of the existential nature of Gunsmoke. Words are never enough. People who talk too much in Gunsmoke, you know, are usually clowns. People are not taken seriously. For Matt, it's the wordless awareness that he has at the end of most episodes, in which he shoots and kills somebody, and then they thank him for the trouble, which is a bizarre premise for a story. You know, the film noir, you know, when the good guy shoots the bad guy, it, you know, usually ends, maybe the bad guy has a parting quip or something, but Gunsmoke is really about Matt almost taking on the experience of the dead person, the wisdom distilled in those last comments. And they become part of Matt. The same way, Walt Whitman pulls in whoever he's writing about to become Walt Whitman, a cosmos. The same thing happens to Matt Dillon. He becomes kind of a cosmic character through his experiences in each episode. And so, while some of the stories can get predictable and hokey, I don't think that's the purpose. I think for the average viewer, it was seeing Matt come to this kind of existential point of what's the right thing to do? What's meaningful in this society, this existence? And certainly upholding the law, however blind and arbitrary it may seem, is part of that. But the ultimate thing is Matt's simple will to endure, to not fold. He's going to stay as the lawman. He's not going to quit and run away, even though there's a couple episodes where he tries to do that, but of course he can't. And so that's kind of his mythic heft, his mythic weight, his mythic raison d'etre, is to experience these extreme situations and the dying of the person, and to kneel there in this kind of very stylized, ritualized way that comes to be accepted as natural when it's the most unnatural thing in the world. And the very fact that, the series, there were probably better written series. I mean, Peckinpah's The Westerner, Have Gun Will Travel, even some of Wanted Dead or Alive, Branded. I mean, there's some great series in there, but none has that kind of pure mythos that I think Matt Dillon achieved. I mean, that James Arness achieved as Matt Dillon. Certainly John Wayne achieved an element of kind of mythic size in his films. And it's interesting that Wayne introduced the series with a little clip to kind of almost pass the movie torch to the television star to be. But, mythos is really strange because mythos doesn't work on a kind of a rational cognitive element. I mean, rationally, if you look at some of these stories, you're like, oh, Jesus, why would that guy be thanking Matt for shooting and killing him, Why didn't he spit in his eye, But that's not what myth does. Myth comes at us like ritual, through a full mental experience, emotional, cognitive, intuitive, whatever elements of the mind or psyche you want to discuss. Myth somehow works on the totality of the mind, as ritual does. That's why some people love, for instance, like the Catholic ceremony, the communion ceremony. And they love the ritual of it, the form of it. And I think Gunsmoke has that same aspect where the form of the story itself becomes kind of the momentary stay against chaos, to borrow the words of Robert Frost, or the idea of order, to use the words of Wallace Stevens, that this story's happened, it has a certain shape, a certain form, and it has some kind of meaning at the end, not necessarily a completely articulated or verbalized meaning, but some kind of meaning just on Matt's face, his reaction, that suggests that out of all this chaos, which the law tries to bring form to chaos, but can be artificial and arbitrary, but out of all this experience, welter of experience, something becomes formalized in that last segment where Matt is with the dying person, and it becomes ritualized. I think of Faulkner's Light in August, where Joe Christmas has been castrated, and I believe it's Hightower who sees the faces of all the characters in the play kind of jumbled together in this kind of tableau, and Faulkner loves that concept of tableau. And I think what he was getting at was that mythic element. A myth ultimately is a tableau. The whole story can be told in the arrangement of these characters. One, because you already know the story of a myth, more or less. I mean, that's why you have a tableau like the nativity scenes. Most people know the Christian nativity stories. All you need is that tableau to bring up that whole welter of the story and all the stuff beyond the story. And that's what I think Gunsmoke did a great job. It tells the story that's not the story. And you see that on Matt's face. Quentin Tarantino does the opposite. Quentin Tarantino, character would mouth off and try to explain, and you'd probably have a rigmarole of kind of deconstructive thoughts, and pitter-patter discussion between the dying man and the man who shot him, and you'd get into some kind of cul-de-sac, intellectual cul-de-sacs of, does this mean anything or not? But Gunsmoke precedes that kind of latter decadent, hyper-Baroque sensibility that we want to use words until words kind of break. We're going to rely on words to give meaning, even if it's partial or contradictory meaning. Gunsmoke ultimately goes beyond meaning. And you see it in that great opening sequence where Matt shoots the other guy down, Hack Bryan, and then holds his gun up for a second, sees that the guy's dead. This is all on Matt, and then holsters his gun, stands up, and it's not a look of relief, it's not a look of triumph, it's a really strange look of just persistence. Life is strange and potentially meaningless, yet Matt is trying to face all that chaos in that moment with his